Hi everyone, this video is on commercial leasing. So this deals with the leasing of commercial property like a retail storefront or an office or a warehouse. So if you're looking to lease a property like that or renew or amend your existing lease, this video is for you. Before we dive in, just a quick note. I find that people sometimes tend to gloss over leasing where they'll sign a lease without really reading it or they're not really aware of what they're signing. And I just want to stress the importance of leasing in general. As a landlord, a lease is really important because if you're buying an income property, the leases are the things that determine the value of your property. Basically, the cash flow you make from your leases will determine how much you can sell your property for in the future in most cases. And as a tenant, a lease is really important because it ties your business to a specific location for 5, 10, 15 years or more in some cases, right? So I suggest that you always get legal counsel involved as early as possible. Don't try to go it alone because leases are very dense and complex contracts, and they can run for many decades. So it's very important that you at least know what you're doing or you seek expert advice, right? Now, having said that, what we'll do is discuss today is a couple of key lease clauses that you should turn your mind to when you're negotiating your next lease. But before we do that, I just want to talk about the two main types of commercial leases. So the first is a gross lease and the second is a triple net lease. Under a gross lease, the tenant basically just pays one rental payment every month, which is called gross rent, and the landlord eats all the other costs of the property. Pretty straightforward. Meanwhile, under a triple net lease, the landlord passes on three major costs: insurance, maintenance, and property tax. So what that means is the tenant will pay the basic monthly rent like they would under a gross lease, but they'll also pay something called additional rent, which basically consists of all the costs of the property like maintenance, insurance, property tax. And the only thing that the landlord has to pay for is structural repairs. So things like the foundations of the building or concrete, parkades and things like that. But basically the landlord is passing on all the other costs to the tenant. And because a triple net lease is much more friendly to a landlord than a gross lease, most leases of commercial property are actually triple net leases. So you should be quite familiar with them, or you should get familiar with them if this is your first time leasing. So now that we've discussed the two main types of leases, let's discuss a couple of the key clauses that you should really think about. The first is rent. Always look at the definitions of rent in the lease. Some people, they'll negotiate the rental rate, say we're paying $10 a square foot, that's $1,000 a month, for example, okay, we're good to go. But even if you look at the definition of monthly rent under a lease, oftentimes a landlord can adjust how the space is measured. Or they can remeasure the space and say that it's bigger than the tenant originally thought, which obviously increases the base rental amount. So really look at how the square footage can change and how that will affect the rent. But more importantly, you should look at additional rent, especially under a triple net lease, because additional rent basically consists of all the costs of the property other than structural repairs. So as a landlord, you're trying to fit in every cost into the definition of additional rent so you can pass it on to your tenant. But as a tenant, you have to be careful about what's included in there because there's the chance for duplication of expenses. For instance, a landlord might charge you a management fee, but they'll also charge you for the salaries of their employees, or the maintenance costs coming out of any portion of the property the landlord is leasing to themselves. Right? So costs can get duplicated, and it's in the landlord's interest to pass everything along to the tenant, but as a tenant, you should be wary of what's included in additional rent. And it's often a heavily negotiated item, so take a close look at those rent definitions before you sign your next lease. Now that we've discussed rent, the next major clause I want to discuss is the permitted use clause, and that's pretty straightforward. It basically sets out what the tenant can do on the property. And as a tenant, you want that permitted use to be as broad as possible because it allows you to try out different types of businesses on the property if things aren't working, just to change things up. But as a landlord, you want that to be as narrow as possible because you want to control what happens on the property, right? You might say the permitted use is a sandwich shop, whereas a tenant might want to say it's a restaurant so that they can sell something more than sandwiches. Tied to the permitted use clause is something called the exclusive use clause. And this is something that tenants will sometimes push for. Basically what that means is a tenant will ask for the exclusive right to be the only person or company that can sell a certain good or service on the property. For instance, a tenant might say that we have the exclusive right to sell coffee on the property. That's great for the tenant because it protects their business. Not so great for the landlord because it ties your hands in terms of attracting other types of tenants. For instance, if only one tenant can sell coffee, as a landlord, you're probably not going to be able to attract a breakfast restaurant, like let's say a Denny's, for example, or a grocery store like a Safeway that has a Starbucks inside of it, because both of those also sell coffee. So be really careful about exclusive use clauses, right? They're great if you're a tenant, not so great if you're a landlord. Moving on to the next major clause is the transfers clause. So the transfers clause basically deals with a situation where the tenant wants to transfer the property to someone else or to lease to someone else. So they can either assign the lease, they can sublease the space, or there can be a change in control of the tenant. And what that means is that the tenant gets bought out and a new group of shareholders owns the tenant company. And as a tenant, you want to have as few restrictions on the change of control or assignment or subleasing as possible, because if the space just isn't working for you, you want to be able to hand it off to somebody else with no headache. But as a landlord, you want to be extra careful about these transfer clauses because, one, you want to control who's actually in the space, but more importantly, you want to make sure that you get paid. You don't want the tenant transferring the lease to some numbered company owned by people that you never met, right? Because you probably made the lease to a specific tenant based on the strength of their financials, for instance. As a landlord, what you'll typically see in most leases is the landlord will say that they have to provide their permission or their consent to any transfer by the tenant. So a tenant has to approach the landlord and ask for their permission to transfer the lease. In order to take that to the next level, what some landlords will do is add a termination clause, which basically says that if the tenant comes to them and asks for their consent to a transfer, so an assignment, a sublease, or a change of control, the landlord can terminate the lease. They can end the lease on that day. And the reason for that is that the landlord will sometimes want to cut the tenant out of the picture and approach the potential new tenant directly to perhaps negotiate a higher rent. Or they can just cut out both tenants and try to negotiate with a third party to move into the space because that third party might be willing to pay more than anybody else. So, transfer clauses and termination clauses sometimes go hand in hand, which takes me to the last clause for today, which is the termination clause. So a termination clause basically is any term of the contract that lets you end it early. And as a tenant, you often won't get any termination clauses under a lease, although you should, I recommend that you can try pushing for them for sure. Typically, the only tenants that get termination clauses or the right to end their lease early are stronger tenants or bigger tenants like Starbucks, McDonald's, and those sorts of things. As a landlord, you'll typically have many termination rights in a contract. For instance, you can terminate it if the tenant is in breach of the contract, if they ask for your consent to a transfer of the lease, or even if you want to demolish the property. And that's something that we're seeing more and more of in the Fraser Valley. You'll see landlords add in these demolition termination clauses into their leases. And they're great for a landlord because essentially you can end the leases early if you plan to redevelop the property, if you want to demolish it and build something bigger. But it also makes it easier to sell the property to a developer because you can say, hey, look, you can easily sell this property because you can just terminate the leases and you can start developing in about a year or so. As a tenant, it's tough because you might have a great location for your business, but the problem becomes that the landlord can end the lease on a year's notice and all of a sudden you're looking for new space. So really pay attention to these termination and demolition clauses because you might want to be in a space for a long time, or you might want to have the ability to get out early. So just turn your mind to it when you're negotiating your next lease. So those are some of the key lease clauses that you should really pay attention to. There's several more. Like I said, leases are very dense, complex contracts. If you are looking to enter into a new lease or amend or renew your existing lease, feel free to reach out. Like I mentioned, I'm a real estate and banking lawyer here at KSW. I've worked on tons of leases for various types of tenants, both landlords and tenants, and I'd be happy to help you with your next lease. If you have any questions about leasing in particular or any other questions related to real estate or banking, feel free to leave them in the comments below and subscribe to our channel and keep an eye out for our next video. So again, I hope this was helpful and do not hesitate to reach out if you need any assistance with your next lease.